Welcome, everyone. This is TechnAct podcast. This is a space where we have conversation with guests, usually researcher, activists, and we discuss different subjects in relation to social movements, gender, sexualities, and digital technologies. As always, my name is Nadia.
My name is Onur.
And my name is Sama.
Yeah, thank you. Today, actually, we have Elin Ferm with us as our guest, who is the co-founder of Norm, which is a norm critical consultancy firm. Elin is an experienced lecturer and workshop leader who is based in Copenhagen in Denmark. Also, she has an activism history at the organization FATA, which is struggling against sexual violence. And we will soon learn more about all these amazing works that Elin has been involved in. But I would like to first give the word to you, Elin, and thank you, first of all, so much for joining us. And I want to ask you, how are you doing?
Thank you. And thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm really well today. It's pretty gray here in Copenhagen.
Yes, thank you, Elin, for joining us today again. And I just wanted to ask, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who is Elin Ferm? And what does it mean for you to be a norm critical educator?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, my name is Elin and my pronouns are she and her. And I was born in Sweden, but I've lived abroad since I was 19. So like Una said, I'm currently residing in Copenhagen. And I have a degree in anthropology and gender studies. And yeah, I've worked in many different organizational settings with equality and inclusion and anti-discrimination the past couple of years. And yeah, in terms of being a norm critical educator, that's a really good question. But I guess for me, it's about both sort of educating people about norm critical thinking and trying to work in a norm critical way whilst facilitating, for example. So making sure to, make the teaching space as accessible as possible. So you can look at language and having breaks and how do you sort of pass the word around in a meeting. And I guess I should say also that when I talk about norm critical thinking, I think of that as like an approach that helps us turn the gaze towards the norm and all these things that we take for granted, for example, related to gender, race, body, sexuality, or class. And I think it's really great because it encourages us to sort of reflect on these norms and how they influence the way that we speak or treat others, which that is the first step of addressing unequal and discriminatory behavior.
Thank you so much. So maybe if you would like, we can start asking you, what do you do in Norm? Or more specifically, tell us first about Norm, your consultancy agency. What does the idea came from?
Yeah, well, so it's me and my co-founder, Stina, who is a digital designer, who started it together. And it actually started with us having pretty terrible time at our old jobs with quite unhealthy working environments. So we thought, how can this be improved? What would these workplaces need? And I'd worked with non-critical thinking in Sweden before in like different settings. And I'd only really come across it in sort of activist settings in Denmark before. So I thought this could be something that we could really use here as a method with these type of workplaces. And when we asked around as well, it was sort of the response that we got that people found it interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I also would like you to open up like what do you do in Norm, and because when we have been looking and that we saw that you are collaborating with many different organizations, very different groups, a very like big variety of groups. And how do you connect with these groups, and what do you do in Norm in that regard?
Yeah, you're right. It's funny because sometimes people say, oh, you should you should find a specific target group. But I think this non-critical thinking kind of works across many different sectors. So we've worked with unions, with universities, with TV production companies, also a dance company, libraries and youth organizations. So it's pretty across the board. But what we do, we often say that we use human-centered methods from anthropology, design, and communication to help organizations create fair and representative environments. And what that means in practice is basically it can be everything from helping companies develop their surveys, for example, regarding discrimination and inclusion, or doing interviews in the workplace, mapping areas or like key areas where they need to start working. We've also done reports for unions, for example, assessing sexual harassment and kind of giving recommendations on what would be the next step, where do you need to go from here. We do quite a few workshops where we help the employees and the leaders sort of practice non-critical thinking in the workplace. We've also been asked to do research actually about Sweden's response to Me Too, from this Denmark's Knowledge Center for Gender Inequality asked us to look into this because they acknowledged that Sweden was perhaps a little bit further ahead in that journey. So that's something we've done as well. We've developed a method guide or a method book about norm-critical facilitation online. So it's really exciting in that way because it's providing a broad span of opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And also, speaking of helping with organizations, different sectors and also unions, I was wondering what tools do you provide to these organizations, or is it just seminar-based, workshop-based, or is it a process? Do you follow up with them? Can you explain a little bit about this specific cases?
Well, overarching, you could say that we work on sort of two levels. So we both help the individuals in the organization sort of turn their gaze onto themselves and their culture. So that could be something like practicing using, more gender neutral language, talking about why that is important. Just things like greeting, tiny detail, but just instead of saying ladies and gentlemen, these kind of things, or or you could look at evaluating, the space taken up in a meeting, like recording, speaking times, also looking at, for example, what is spoken about with whom, or we had a project in collaboration with a company where they were looking at when they met somebody in the corridor, who just casual sort of social conversation, the leaders were asked to evaluate who were they speaking to about what, and realized that a lot of the men were speaking to the other men in the organization about sports or company related issues, and then they were talking to the women in the organization about families and stuff like this. So kind of digging into those everyday norms and making them more aware, and acknowledging that change sort of starts with ourselves in our everyday. And then we also work on sort of the other level, which is the organizational structure. And there is more about looking at policies, for example, helping them develop them, looking at wages, representation in terms of the board. And that's not just how many of a given group are present, but also how are they present, for example, who is this organization built for, who works as a manager, who's a high-level manager, who's middle-level manager. We could also look at things like parental leave, for example. So helping them make this visible, measuring, understanding it and tracking it. And then setting up systems that enable them to make more inclusive decisions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is very interesting to see how can you in that way also contribute to organizational cultures, and seeing it as a constantly changing and evolving process. And I was actually also curious in that regard. Obviously we had this process with the pandemic, and a lot of organizations or groups or people obviously have been using online spaces all the time, almost in many contexts. And I think in Denmark also that was the norm, also in many ways. So in relation to that, I want to ask you, how do you define these inclusive online meetings that you have been talking about before, and what is your approach to it?
Well, yeah, it's a really good question, and that's something I think we've all been sort of forced to work with, whether we like it or not. But in some ways, I would say it is very much like sort of IRL meetings, but it's just a heightened form. So, for example, facilitation, I feel, needs to be a little bit stricter or more directed, at least. But in other ways, it's like things that are important in real life are also important online. But things like lived experience. So thinking about who enters this digital room and what experiences did they come with, but also looking at my own, what experiences do I carry and how does that influence how I facilitate this meeting, how I pass the word around, what are my sort of choices of references and things, materials and things like this. But then I also think it's really important to, with preparation, sending out agendas, guidelines, information about, how is this meeting going to run? And during the meeting, having very clear guidelines. I think a lot of people are now assuming that everyone's familiar with, this is how we do it online, but that's also different different spaces. So a way of being more inclusive is to make that clear to everyone at the beginning of the meeting or the session. How do we interact? Do we turn our mic off? Do we use the chat for questions and things like this? Also here I find facilitation of breakout rooms is something that I have also experienced on the other end. So not facilitating, but sometimes being in meetings or workshops. I really appreciate when people have directed this facilitation. So for example, suggesting that the person with the names who starts with the letter A or closest to A will be the facilitator of this exercise for this long. So that's something I've picked up as well. I think is nice, so that you're not just left in a breakout room, with with people not knowing like who takes charge. So making it very clear, what are people supposed to do, how long are they doing it for, etc. And then rounds as well is something that we work a lot with, both on and offline, but to give everyone a chance to speak without interruption. So passing, the word around, and then also making sure there's a possibility to say pass or just pass it onwards to the next person. But that's kind of creating a more sort of democratic way of taking turns, I find. And another inclusive thing, I guess, would be to really think about variation and breaks. I think a lot of people tend to forget that breaks are extremely important, especially online. So making space for that in a meeting or a session quite often, and also kind of trying to vary exercises if you can, maybe vary with like different speakers to keep the brain awake. And then also thinking about creating a sort of safer space online if you can. So having like presentation rounds where you say both your name and your pronouns, but also asking if the participants have anything, that the rest of the participants need to know about them in the meeting. So that could be, if I have a really sore back, for example, I could say in this meeting, I'm going to be standing up sometimes, just, that's not because I'm not listening, but it's because my back is really hurting. Or if I have a sick child, maybe I need to have my phone not on silent. So if I need to take my phone, why. So again, just clarity and communication. And sometimes, this depends on the setting, right? But if we hold workshops, we try and always work with these sort of creating common guidelines. So having all participants reflect on, what do I need to be able to feel comfortable participating in this meeting? And then we take a round and sort of agree on these guidelines. So that could be, I really feel like, we need to take turns speaking and make sure to listen to each other to the end of a sentence, like not interrupting. Maybe I want everything to stay in the room. A lot of people mention respect as a point they want to sort of put on the list, and then we try and dig into that. What does respect mean for you? Because that could be quite different things. So yeah, those are some things we picked up along the way.
Mhm, mhm.
That is super interesting. Actually, it looks like you maybe agree or maybe think that digital technologies are in fact helping in terms of inclusion. But maybe my question is, do you think that digital technologies are helping in terms of inclusion? Because so far, what I'm listening is very positive in terms that uh, you set up a set of norms and everyone agrees on these things, so it might look like digital technologies are actually helping in this kind of relationships that maybe in an IRL setting sometimes doesn't happen. But would you also, and another question in relation to that, would you change something to improve um, digital technologies in inclusion?
Well, it's a big question, that, but it's an important one. I think there are pros and cons to digital technologies in terms of inclusive facilitation and norms. Um, I think something that I've thought about was when we held Pride lectures. We held a lecture at Pride in Copenhagen last year, especially, and then they had decided to sort of broadcast that so that people could, both a smaller number of people could come to the tent that it was in, and other people could watch it online with a professional production company. And that just meant also that it could reach out much further, like in the country, outside the country, and also for people that are not out yet. So that provided, the anonymity of being able to access this kind of information online in your bedroom, for example. So that's a pro, like I think is really important that we consider going forward from this as well. And in terms of cons, I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but I just read the latest issue of the Swedish anti-racist and feminist magazine, Mana. And they talked about, these issues in terms of who owns and controls digital technologies, that I thought was a really important point. But also that technology is not neutral. I mean, as I'm sure you all are aware of, but that how it reflects the world that we live in, I thought was a really important point as well. So, that existing in a world that is already shaped by racist and sexist and queerphobic structures, for example, these kind of digital technologies and end up reproducing them. So I think, we need to sort of deconstruct this idea that technology is our savior, and then keep working for social justice, IRL, and then that will lead to a more digital, equal world as well.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with the points that you just made. Just moving away from digital technologies and impacts, I would actually want to reorient the topic towards your work and your work with the organizations that not necessarily share the language or knowledge that you are offering to them, or it might not be accessible to them, because of course that is your kind of goal to make them think and make them change their ways of working with things, right? So I'm really curious to know, how do you navigate or transfer your knowledge in anthropology and gender studies and communication in the critical way to a broader audience in different sectors? And what challenges have you faced?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's one that we struggle with, I think, every day. Because sometimes you get into a situation where from an academic point of view or an activist point of view, of course, the language that you want to and need to use is considered perhaps a little harsh or too much of a sort of truth telling. I don't know how you want to look at it, but people sometimes we've had to kind of use a softer sort of language to get in the door. And then once we're in the door, we can kind of deconstruct this language and look at what is behind this, why it's important to talk about power. For example, people are very scared of power, the word power, I find. Also things like naming things feminist in Denmark is a little bit sensitive, which is obviously a struggle if you yourself identify as a feminist. But sometimes, I mean, I think a lot of our project, like with this project, has also been to try and bridge the gap between academia and a sort of the business world, or whatever you want to call it, organizational world, and perhaps also activism, sort of that kind of triangle, and stand in the middle and try and build bridges, which I think is important, because I also think that even if academia might have the most sort of precise language, it can sometimes be a little bit inaccessible for people as well, which then ends up being excluding in its own way. So yeah, but it's a tricky one for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think it is very like important, like as you mentioned, these three realms that we can talk about, as let's say organizations, and then this activist perspectives, and also academia, about what you are doing, also to connecting these different groups to each other. But also, I think this is maybe probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but so much in connection to your history and trajectory of activism, that you have this like position and experience in your previous involvements, and we know one of them is that your involvement with FATA, which has been an organization doing very valuable work against sexual violence. So could you tell us a little bit about how did you, like from also a personal experience, how did you encounter FATA, and how were you involved in this group?
So they're an organization that works against sexual violence and for consent, and it's a volunteer-run organization. But they're really, really good at kind of media, social media. So I think I'd seen them around, and then they were just looking for more volunteers to sort of set up this lecturing group, where so we traveled around and held lectures about sexual violence and consent for schools and universities and workplaces. We also did a tour actually for sort of the Swedish version of jury members across the country, which was really interesting to see sort of their idea of how you can step into the courtroom as a blank page. We had sort of different ideas about that, but yes, that was really important, and it's been really interesting to work with them, and I think they've done a really great job pushing this agenda in Sweden. But perhaps there was more to the question that I forgot about now.
Yeah, of course, you have a very inspiring trajectory as well. And I just wondered, do you want to add something else regarding your work and activism?
Well, there's been another project that I've worked on as well, which is sort of in extreme sports, which is something I've done since I was very young. And I think that is kind of where my initial sort of feminist awakening / anger happened. So in that way is also important. But just like me and my younger brother started riding this thing called wakeboarding. It's like a snowboard on water when we were teenagers, and we were kind of approached somewhat very differently, just based on our gender and how we were perceived in the sport. And I think that sort of sparked something in me that led me to then start this organization later on, which was an organization that I kind of would have needed when I was a teenager maybe. But it's been about creating a sort of separate space for women and non-binary folks within the sport. So holding events. And I would also say it kind of has an anti-capitalist side to it, in the sense that it's been also not against the idea of competing, but these spaces have been trying to create a space where women and non-binary folks could work and play together. So sort of like working from this pass it on idea as well, that if you know something, you don't have to be a pro or anything, because this was events held for complete beginners up to professional level. So it was like very mixed. So it wasn't that we had a coach or that the sort of top riders should teach the beginners, but it was like, if you've learned how to start, for example, you could tell somebody else on the dock, and then really encouraging this kind of more inclusive thinking in the sport. So that's been really fun as well to run. And yeah, just creating those kind of inclusive events.
Could you repeat the name of this?
Yeah, I don't think I actually said it, but at the time we called it Nordic Wake Girls, because it was an organization that was also based in Norway and Sweden and Denmark. And then, yeah, it's during COVID, it kind of fell into a bit of a sleepy state, as you can imagine, as it was based on big events across and a lot of travel. Yeah. And we've also considered a name change in terms of having a more inclusive name. But yeah.
Fascinating work.
Yeah, very nice. And I just want to say thank you so much for actually joining us today. I think your story is very inspirational for so many people who want to do work and include like feminist and queer perspectives and their history of activism to their own career, and how do they, contribute to this more groups that we kind of always detach from each other, as you also mentioned, like different businesses, organizations, academia groups. And I think in that regard your work is very valuable. And yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and opinions with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was great to be invited, and good luck with the rest of the podcast series.
Yes, I would also want to thank you again, and we really enjoyed listening to you and your experience in Sweden and Denmark. Yeah, I also want to take this moment to thank our listeners, our podcast listeners. Thank you so much for listening to us today. We had a wonderful conversation with Elin Ferm about her experience in non-critical consulting and her history of activism. If you would like to follow TechnAct's previous and upcoming episodes, you can find us on platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. For more information about our wider research cluster, you can follow TechnAct on Facebook to learn about our activities, other updates, and give us feedback. Our podcast and research cluster is located at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. See you next time.